Hello, we're live. Hello and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. Starting a few minutes late, I apologize for that. I'm Brandon Tessers.
I'm Olivia Candosia.
And this is not therapy. Wait, I said it wrong. And I'm a licensed therapist.
And I'm not.
But will be soon. But this is not therapy. That's the I messed up the tagline. Must be thinking about other things.
Most definitely.
What this is an open conversation. It is time for us to be here. Olivia and I will be talking with one another. We kind of obliquely reference, but to be more explicit, Olivia is an intern therapist working here and studying here at Effective Artistry as she prepares to become a fully licensed clinician. Yeah, we're going to be talking with one another. Hello, Mimi the Evie, and we will be talking with all of you. For those of you who are watching but not either here live or for any other reason not willing or not able to participate in the chat, we're just going to be doing our best to make our guesses about what might be of interest to you and how we might be coming across. For those of you who are able and willing to participate in the chat, we get a lot more information. Just like any conversation, the things you say, we see, and it impacts what we think, and we get a clearer picture, and we can kind of go back and forth. So it's not therapy, it's just a conversation. We will start by talking about whatever we're talking about, but we can go anywhere like any conversation. There are no rules, and that can be questions and answers, and it can be jokes, and it can be anything, and certainly it can go from any topic to any other topic. Olivia and I will not stay on the same topic for very long anyway, so please don't try to constrain yourself and not jump in or wait for a break or whatever. We work at a private therapy practice called Effective Artistry. Our office is located in Northbrook, Illinois. We do individual, couples, and family therapy. We are also, as we've been saying, getting ready to launch a couple therapy groups and are still firming up the exact details about those, but can start to say at least some about, like, Olivia will be working with Caitlin Miller, who used to be on the stream for quite a long time, and will likely come on the stream again at some point in the future. The two of them will be working together to run a therapy group, heavily involving the use of tarot cards.
The Fool's Journey.
Yeah, so not doing tarot as in like reading tarot or whatever, but exploring the archetypes.
And implementing some drama therapy and talk therapy in there, some art therapy, and it'll all be online. Yeah. That's as much as I got right now.
It'll be starting in the new year sometime, January or February. We'll give more details as they get firmed up. But yeah, primarily aimed at people who are feeling stuck, purposeless, or who are interested in exploring a sense of, developing more of a sense of purpose and connection, working in a group with one another and exploring things through drama therapy, art therapy, and group therapy, all structured around the central concept of exploring different archetypes from the tarot deck, which is very cool. I'm very excited about.
I'll talk to you more about it outside because I have questions.
Yeah, we will keep talking about it. That's one of, I think at the moment there are at least 3 other groups being developed, and a few more than that are like in the early stages of people are exploring some things. We've been excited to get to that phase to be doing group therapy, and we're getting there just now at the end of this year, beginning of next year. So a lot of things will be happening in that department. We'll read out comments as they come in because everybody only sees comments from. So we're streaming on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook simultaneously, and you'll only see comments from other people on the same platform. So sometimes we're responding to a comment. If you're on Twitch, we're responding to a comment from YouTube, and you don't see it, so we'll read things out. And keep in mind that this is a public forum, just like you are here as a member of the public. Other people will be here too. That's one of the many reasons it's not therapy. Yeah, I think that's boilerplate stuff.
Boilerplate?
The stuff you got to do at the beginning to like set the stage, and it's the same every time.
Yeah, I just never heard boilerplate before.
I've never heard that phrase.
I'm
not sure that I'm using it exactly the way most people would use it. because it often, I think, refers to things that are like relatively meaningless and overlooked.
And this is
Just standard boilerplate. And this, some of it at least, I think it's not like the end of the radio ad where someone's like, services may vary,
Right.
Whatever. Hello.
Do you ever train to be an auctioneer? Or do you like have to learn how to talk really fast? I have friends that are like professional auctioneers,
Really?
and like all the theater vocal warm-ups really came in handy.
I naturally speak very quickly, I am told. And certainly I've done a lot of voice and speech training, but never specifically to like speed up the rate of speech. I think if anything, my professors and directors and various people have been trying to slow me down over the years.
It's so funny because I consider you to like talk very slow, and I just am like, are you understanding him? Like, am I catching up to him?
Well, it's also possible that some of the work they've done with me over the years
Has worked.
and I speak more slowly than I used to. Certainly, like when I get into certain positions, when I get nervous, and I don't get nervous nearly as much as I used to, or a lot of the time it would happen when I was reading something. Will I do a belly dance today? No, never. You keep asking, but I won't. That was a joking response, and then all of a sudden I'm like, I'm not really mad. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I speak quickly or not anymore.
Yeah.
I still get feedback all the time that when I take pauses that I think are very clear invitations and openings to people to respond. And then after a period of time has passed that I deem to have been like, okay, they don't want to say anything, so I'll continue to say something instead of just making it awkward. That will not come across, and people don't hear that pause as an actual stop. I don't know how much of that is impacted by speed and how much of that is impacted by people just wanting to hear what I might have to say next, or not feeling as though whatever they have to say would be of interest, or just assuming
That would be
I've
me
got more to say.
when I started here.
Yeah.
I was like, he's still got stuff to say. You always have stuff to say though, so now I have to interrupt.
I do. I always have stuff to say. I mean, everybody always has stuff to say. The difference is not in having something to say, it's in where's your bar internally for what does your thought, like, what does it have to be? What bar does it have to pass to be worth saying out loud?
I talk to myself all the time about that now because of you. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, like, you do have something to say. Do you want to say it? What? I'm still evaluating it, but like I'm recognizing that there are things I want to say.
I mean, so we were talking some last week, I think, about the fact that you and I both have somewhat of a theater background. Did you ever do improv stuff? I think there is improv. I think is treated like a little more magical than it truly is. But there is a lot of cool stuff, and it's a cool way to like train yourself on certain things. And one of those things is it's just better to do something than nothing, and just trust that the people around you will do something with it, make something of it, respond to it in some way that is useful. If you're sitting there quiet, no one can respond to you. Did you ever do clown work?
Yeah, I went to Italy for clown work, Brandon.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I went
Very
to
cool.
Accademia dell'Arte and spent a month there.
Was that specifically like Commedia?
Commedia, and then first 2 weeks Commedia, second 2 weeks clowning.
I feel like this is real inside baseball acting stuff.
Yeah,
I
loved it.
A concept from clown work that I love is the idea of taking the drop, which is like embracing failure. You know, that clowns, I'm not talking about Commedia specifically, I'm talking about the American concept of clowns, which is the general concept of clowns, are people that fail. You know, they throw a bucket to put out the fire, and out comes confetti or whatever, right? That's like the humor in clowns, is that they're earnestly attempting
one simple
and
task,
just failing over and over. The man who did most of the clown work that I did, he taught most of it, had a 20-minute solo clown routine of a clown trying to kill itself and just failing over and over and over for 20 minutes in like various different ways.
Fascinating.
anyway, taking the drop is about like embracing that failure.
Yeah.
Just leaning into it, putting yourself into it, letting yourself be the object of ridicule. I'm sure that other people would explain it differently and probably better than I am. But I think that's a big part of it, right? Is that worst case scenario, if you put something out there that everybody's like, that was terrible, as long as you can take the drop and be like, all right, that was terrible, then it's better still that you put that out there than if you were hanging back not putting anything out.
Mm-hmm. I think that's why acting has been so beneficial for me. At least I could do it there, practice it there, even if I wasn't doing it in my real life.
Yeah, I think for me, acting, I don't know, talk a lot about acting. I guess maybe we will until and unless people take us in a different direction. Because acting, I think, overlaps with therapy in a lot of ways, in that what you're doing as an actor is doing something that all humans do just by definition, by default, all the time, right? We're all behaving in ways that we have that are impacted by our thoughts and our feelings and that are aimed at communicating certain things to certain people or evoking particular responses. But actors are doing it in a way that's intentionally designed in advance, if that makes sense. Like,
unless it's improv.
Unless it's improv. I do think acting and improv are two entirely distinct categories. Yes. Other than like the convention of being a group of people standing on a stage, like that's the only thing that the two of them have in common. Otherwise, they're the opposite.
Yeah.
Because when you're acting, it's entirely about knowing in advance everything that's going to happen, but then the process of being the end result of what you're aiming for as an actor is to do and say and observe and experience a couple hours worth of stuff that you have done and said and observed and experienced dozens of times previously, but to do it in a way that feels to you and reads to others as though it is the first time that you've done it, said it, observed it, experienced it every single time.
I've taken classes on how to make that organic, very Meisner-esque.
Yeah, well, how to get there. I guess we're talking about a particular kind of acting, right? Like obviously there are different. I'm not talking about like different theoretical approaches. I'm talking about different like formats of theater. You know, in commedia, you're not trying to appear as though you are experiencing something for the first time as a normal human. But we're talking about like the kind of acting that most Americans are most familiar with.
Kitchen sink is what I call it.
Kitchen sink, yeah, kitchen sink dramas. Naturalistic acting. And even that is, I don't know why I'm feeling like some clock ticking of how long I should talk about this before moving on, and I should just let
I'm noticing it. I'm like,
should just talk about it unless people say other things, I guess.
Is it too inside baseball for you?
Maybe that's my concern, is that it's not of interest or relevance to people. But well, I mean, yes, likely that's what I'm thinking, is like, I don't know if people are as interested in this because they're not tuning into an acting stream. And then I guess maybe just thinking about how to make that relevant. But anyway, getting in my head a little bit, which is, as we're talking about, unhelpful in this endeavor, as it is at most.
Well, I could talk not your ear off, but I could relate this back to drama therapy if we come to it.
Sure. Yeah, tell us a bit about drama therapy.
I've been thinking a lot about projective techniques, which, if people are familiar with like narrative theory, it's like the idea of externalizing.
Just assume no one's familiar with any theories.
Oh, great. I get a little reasonably frustrated when I'm talking with someone who won't take the risk and put something out. Like, I know it's harder for some people than others. And I want to meet people where they are, but it can get really stressful if you are the one who keeps like taking the risk to volunteer first or tell a story that might not go over well, or other things in a conversation that can be theoretically a little bit risky.
Sorry, not sure if that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense to me. That, I mean, different people might phrase this differently, but I'll say what I'm getting across and you can clarify if I'm not understanding what you're putting out there. That being the person to kind of initiate and prompt and move things forward, being the person who puts yourself out there, and then even if it's well received and even if the other person likes it, whatever, but they don't reciprocate, can certainly get very annoying and tiring over time. It can very much lead to the decline and death of relationships.
It makes me think of like, I always consider myself the question asker, like being curious, and I would get frustrated, like, why is no one asking me questions? But then I talk with you and you're like, if you want to say something, just say it. Maybe that's not directly related, but that made me think of it.
Well, I think it's related for sure, because at the root of it, what we're saying is that doing something which is effortful and or uncomfortable in conversing with someone, like, you can't do that forever. It's not sustainable, and it needs to be reciprocated. My mentor used to use the phrase that relationships require an equal exchange of energy to be sustainable, and that's a very vague term in that sense that can take many different forms, but that over time, there needs to be an equal amount. Each person in the relationship has to have some sense that there's balance between how much I'm getting and how much I'm giving. We can do temporarily, we can give more than we receive, but over time it goes away. And it's not just for the person who's giving more than they're getting, because the person who's getting more than they're giving in any real relationship is going to feel more and more guilty and stressed over time about how much there's an imbalance there. So those relationships fall away. And that particular thing you're talking about, putting yourself out there, doing anything that a person identifies as putting themselves out there or taking a risk is effortful. But some of the things that you might do that you think of as taking a risk, to me, are not effortful, and I don't feel like I'm taking a risk. The same with what you're talking about, right? Like, if you're taking on, another term that gets used for this a lot is emotional labor. If you're taking on the emotional labor, doing the work of trying to facilitate conversation, trying to figure out what they want to talk about, and then ask the right questions in order to give them permission to talk about it, and then waiting for others to do the same for you. Some will, and some won't. And when they don't, it's going to be frustrating over time. Interesting improv practice might even be useful for unmasking. A lot of my experiences as an autistic person growing up is whatever I say will come off as weird, so it's safer to stay quiet. Improv sounds like it's challenging that, to engage and push past that fear of appearing weird. Well, there's certainly some to that. I'm going to read this next comment, and then most of my friends are pretty introverted, and I try to be understanding, but it makes me really appreciate people who can initiate and put themselves out there. Yeah, for sure. So we're talking about anybody that takes some of that burden off of you, does some of that work for you. And again, different levels of effort for different people, but certainly there are trends and whatever, right? Whatever I say will come off as weird, so it's safer to stay quiet. Masking is something that comes up a lot when you're discussing neurodiversity. I did a presentation at Aurora University last Friday, and masking kept coming up, even though when I do presentations, I solicit questions ahead of time to get a sense of like, what is it that people are actually interested in? And nobody really talked about that. And it just came up because it comes up a lot. And I think this does have a lot to do with acting and improv, what exactly masking means. In neurodiversity circles, masking typically means making an attempt to appear as though you are normal or neurotypical, right? Making an attempt to appear as though you are not neurodivergent. That's not the only use of that word, but for many people, that's what they're meaning by it. And for even more people, what am I trying to say here? There are words that we utilize where if you were to ask us for like the actual definition, we would define it in a particular way. But in practice, we use the word sometimes to mean that, but also to mean various other things. But consciously, if we're trying to identify what do we mean, we keep coming back to that same one. So it's really common for people to use the word masking to mean a bunch of different things. But if they sit down and say, what do I mean by masking? They're talking about attempting to appear normal. Part of the reason for that is because a version of what we mean often by masking is, again, one of those universal, inevitable human things, which is what you say, how you behave. That's all impacted by your ideas of how the people around you will interpret you, always. not always consciously, right? That right now I am speaking English and I'm not making a conscious decision to be like, I should speak in English because that's what the people here speak, right? It's just plays into that. And that plays into like every word that I choose and every gesture that I make. I'm not consciously doing these things, but they're impacted by this. Another way of saying it is, if you interact with your mother and you take video of yourself interacting with your mother, and then you take video of yourself interacting with a friend and video of yourself interacting with a colleague and whatever, you will be different in each of those scenarios. You'll speak differently, you'll use different words, different gestures. A version of this that people are more aware of is that you dress differently in different environments, right? Mm-hmm. That is purposeful, is deliberate, and there's nothing wrong with that. Mm-hmm. That's an inherent part of human communication. We have to be building what we do on top of an idea of how the other person will interpret what we're doing. Now, there is a version of that that happens to people, and again, this happens to everybody, but different contexts, where it becomes conscious and effortful, where rather than just the words coming out and we can logically deduce that they are informed by my idea of what words you know and how you interpret them, I'm actually having a conscious thought of what words should I use? How should I phrase this? Mm-hmm. How should I, kind of the joke, right? Of like, what do I do with my hands? Mm-hmm. You know, most of the time you don't think about what you're doing with your hands. They're doing something. They're just, you know, thinking about it. But then you get into this mode where you take conscious control. You're putting in actual thought into your behavior. And then you're like, oh, I don't normally think or pay attention to what's going on with my hands. So now that I'm thinking about it, I don't know what looks normal anymore. So that's a very common version of what we're talking about.
That's me on the stream. I'm like, my hand is on my face. When do you put your hand? Like, I'm thinking about it.
Yeah. It comes up a lot in acting, right? Because you're paying so much attention to how you are coming across to people. Mm-hmm. By design.
Touching the furniture, not touching the topography.
So one of the ways people talk about masking is attempting to appear as though you are normal or not neurodivergent. When we're using it in that way, though, we don't necessarily mean whether it's effortful or not. Because sometimes people will say, like, I'm masking in that sense, meaning like I'm actively thinking about what should I say, how do I come across as though I'm not weird, mm-hmm. whatever. But sometimes people will also say things like, oh, I've been masking my whole life, or like I'm masking without even realizing it, or I've just been trained to mask. Especially when we're talking about unmasking, we're very frequently referring to this not conscious decision to behave in a certain way. We're just making an evaluation that the way in which we behave has been impacted by our thoughts and experiences about what is normal and what is not normal. So I'm trying to make that even in this case, there's two different kind of axes. There's whether it's something you're effortfully, consciously doing or just happening. And then there's whether we're talking about that I'm doing something specifically in order to appear normal or to avoid appearing weird or neurodivergent in some way, or whether we're just talking about generally that the way in which I am behaving is impacted by the people around me and how I'm trying to come across. The metaphor I like to use for this is, imagine that you are white light, and then what we would call identity is a particular lens or a prism, right? If there's white light and we put a red lens over it, then the light that comes through is red. Scientifically speaking, from my understanding, is what we've done with that lens is that in the white light, it contains all the spectrums of the colors of light that are visible to the human eye. And once that light hits that lens, all of those wavelengths reflect off of the lens and go back and don't come through, except for the ones that look red to us. So you are white light, the real you, the authentic you, white light that contains everything. How you are behaving in any given moment is an identity, meaning a lens that is filtered through. And whatever's coming out is still a part of who you are. It might not be the most enjoyable version of yourself. Certainly it's not going to always be the easiest, most default version. You know, some of them are more effortful than others. Some we enjoy more than others or are more comfortable than others.
I love when you talk about this, Brandon. Every time I'm like, wow.
And I think that's a really useful way to look at masking, because otherwise masking often gets talked about as it's a pathological thing almost.
Mhm.
Like I'm doing this bad thing that I shouldn't be doing because I've been forced to or broken or whatever. But like through the lens of commedia dell'arte, which is a particular
Mask work.
it's mask work, and the different masks represent different things and communicate different things. Masks are useful. They're tools. Identity is useful. It's a tool.
Mhm.
We wear clothing not just because it protects us from the environment or whatever, but also because this particular clothing we choose to wear is part of how we are projecting to other people what we want them to see.
Mhm.
So masking is a tool, and it's, I think, very useful to think of it as you are always wearing a mask. Some of those masks you like better than other masks.
Mhm.
When you're wearing a mask that you don't enjoy wearing or that's highly effortful for you, that's not necessarily a bad thing if there's good reason for that. Right?
Aromatherapy intervention, Brandon. Making your masks.
Sure. Yeah, there are times where it's like, okay, if I accidentally give the wrong impression here or impact that person differently than I want to, they could kill me, right?
Mhm.
Like that's an actual real thing. Doesn't typically happen in most people's lives a lot of the time, but it does happen or can happen at least. And in other cases, the stakes are so low that it's like, well, if I accidentally give them the wrong impression, there's no problem. They'll just let me know, we'll work through it, or they won't care, or whatever. So wearing a particular mask that is more effortful or more uncomfortable for us is something that we only want to do when it's really worth doing. And that often gets filtered through the language of like being safe or accepted or whatever. And there's utility in that language, although a lot of the time it's not actually about safety, like being in danger or not. It's about my concerns about how this person will perceive me.
Mhm.
I can worry that I'm not safe in a situation in which I actually am safe, just like I can feel as though I am safe and not worry about it in a situation in which I'm actually in danger. That's a lot of what we're talking about in trauma is that, right? There was a situation in which I didn't think I was in danger, and then it turned out that I was. And had I known, I could have potentially not been there or whatever, right? And that modifies how we pay attention moving forward. All that to say, I think improv can be very helpful and useful in this practice of exploring what people often call unmasking. I also generally encourage people not to think of it through the lens of unmasking, because that implies a thing that is impossible, and so everyone will just feel like they've never accomplished it.
Mhm.
That's where people start to get worried about, am I being my real self? Am I being true to me? Is this the true me, the real, the authentic core? And none of that is real. You can't, all the white light doesn't come out in any given situation. It's not about whether you're being real or fake. There's nothing you can say that you can't say, and there's nothing you can do that you can't do. So that's not fake. Sometimes by fake, people just mean effortful. I am consciously choosing to do this thing, and that's fine. And again, that's taxing, so we don't want to have to do that. But there are situations in which it is useful.
There's I don't know how relevant this is, but there was an exercise I did in an improv class where you had to do 6 characters in 1 minute. So every 10 seconds, you would have to change into a different character. And that was the most effective improv exercise I've ever done because it really did not give me time to think about anything else. And I have utilized that now with other people, and it's great. That's all.
Yeah. I like one of the common phrases you'll hear in the acting world is acting is reacting. And that's meant to convey that, like, when people first think about or first approach acting, they tend to think of it through the lens of like, what am I doing? What am I projecting? I gotta be angry, or I gotta yell, I gotta whatever, right? And then what skilled actors really tend to focus more on is it's not about your effortfully doing something, because that comes across as effortful. In other words, if you're trying to make yourself cry on stage, that's not going to read as authentic, because in real life, people don't try to make themselves cry. They sometimes just cry, but generally people are trying to stop themselves from crying, and they can't stop it. It comes out anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And that reads as real. There's a particular scene from the movie SLC Punk that I think of with this, with Matthew Lillard, who is one of the most criminally underrated actors of our age. where he's like he's so clearly trying not to cry, and like it comes out in that explosion that will often happen with people where like snot and spit comes out with it. And
oh, that's beautiful.
So acting is reacting meaning is what we're trying to do, and there's all different techniques and ways to try and get this to happen. But what we're trying to do is make it so that I am not thinking about myself as people generally aren't in interactions. I'm paying attention to and being impacted by the things that are happening around me. I'm not in my head, I'm observing.
Sounds like being a therapist.
There's a lot of overlap. And that those things are impacting me in such a way that my response is what the script calls for my response to be. And that's very difficult to do, which is why good acting is a very rare thing, but you also do know it when you see it. And the whole point of like acting training is to develop processes to be able to do that regularly, because anybody can, like, in the right circumstance, given the right thing, can do it. You know, it'll happen. And we're just talking about people who have different approaches and different things that up the frequency of how much that occurs. There's a couple comments here I read. After I learned about people sometimes mirroring the body language of someone they want to be on the good side of, I got really self-conscious every time someone like crossed their legs, because then if I wanted to cross my legs, what if they thought I was trying to impress them? Or if I don't, do they think I don't like them? Now I have to try not to think about it so much. Also makes great whiskey. Oh, I think that must have been a comment about something I was saying that I don't remember what it was a response to.
So many thoughts about mirroring. But that awareness I've gotten in my head about that before too. But mirroring, I think, is something that just happens naturally. I think.
Yes, I mean that's the point of these kinds of like concepts, is that we're observing something that
Matthew Lillard.
Oh yes, Matthew Lillard. Yes, he does make a good whiskey, and has a really good. Well, he's involved with a company, and also runs a really cool gaming-oriented company with his friends. He plays Dungeons and Dragons. I didn't know that when I used to think of how great an actor he was, but it makes a lot of sense. I mean, D&D and other tabletop role-playing games are structured improv, depending on how people play them. Yeah, he was my favorite actor for like when I was an actor, I was studying and like out there.
I can't put a face to it.
Funny enough, the most recognizable would be either he played Shaggy in the Scooby-Doo movies, the live-action ones, or he was in the Scream movie. SLC Punk is one of my favorite movies of all time. Brilliant movie.
Wow.
I don't have the emotional energy to watch that movie very much these days, but I should make that required viewing for people who work at Effective Artistry. It's such a good movie.
There aren't many rules here, but
the only rule is you've got to watch SLC Punk. I mean, the fact that it's set in Salt Lake City, that's what the SLC stands for. When I was living in Salt Lake City at the time, grew up there my teenage years. Anyway, yes, mirroring is a thing that happens automatically. I think one thing that's helpful to know when we're talking about psychological concepts, just really wish I could get Beadle and Grimm Strahd set. Beadle and Grimm is the gaming company that Matthew Lillard runs with his friends, and they mostly, as far as I'm aware, just make really cool accessories. They don't make their own games. They just make very cool accessories and like leather-bound versions of like other people's stuff.
Okay.
I run Strahd in person. I could put it to use. Well, yeah, that's great. Strahd is a very famous Dungeons and Dragons campaign, like set of a story and adventure lines and whatever. Strahd von Zarovich is the Dungeons and Dragons version of Dracula. Vampire.
Vlad the Impaler.
Yeah, but not Vlad the Impaler. That's the historical figure that people associate with Dracula. But Strahd is actually a vampire, not a warmonger.
Why I mentioned Vlad the Impaler is because I was looking at a Count Chocula's cereal box, and I was like, this is so funny how we like got to this cereal box because of,
It is, as a father of young children, it is fascinating to me how much they love like the monsters,
Yeah.
zombies and mummies and vampires and ghosts. I don't know how much of it is just in like how it's presented to them, or how much of it is Halloween, or
Yeah, at my camp that I went to, they had like Mad Balls were like the awards, and like you wanted to get the Mad Balls, and they were these creepy looking like baseballs with faces and like gore, but like it was a hit over the summer, not even Halloween time.
Well, there used to be, like when I was younger in the 90s, there were some kind of, this is a vague memory, so maybe I'm misremembering, but it was like a ball, like a squishy ball that had like monster faces that if you squished it, like the ears would pop out, or like
those are still a thing. Go to Five Below.
I forgot where we were. Don't know. Maybe it doesn't matter.
Dungeons and Dragons, Strahd.
Oh, well, it is interesting when we get. I'm not actually totally sure the evidence behind the. Oh, mirroring.
Mirroring.
All right, good, because I was about to talk about Vlad the Impaler.
Oh man.
Mirroring's probably better. Yes, with these psychological concepts. So a lot of the time when we're discussing these things collectively, like when people are discussing these things, but I do it myself because that's how the language works. We'll use words that like think or believe or want or whatever, that there's a version of those words can refer to a conscious experience. And by conscious, we mean I am aware of a thought that I am having. A conscious, anything of which you are conscious is something of which you are aware. So the divide between conscious and non-conscious, I think, tends to get treated as this like mystical thing that you can only do in analysis, but it's a black and white, something is either conscious or not. And conscious means you are aware of it in your internal subjective experience, in your, call it working memory, awareness, conscious space, whatever. So we all have thoughts from time to time. Some of us have these thoughts more often and others less, where it's like a thought that we are observing. We are aware of this thought. These words, though, also get used to refer to narratives, like theories and explanations for why someone would behave the way they're behaving, regardless of whether there's a conscious thought involved. Meaning that if someone says, oh, he thinks that if he's a jerk, that woman will be more interested in him, the think in that sentence could refer to he has a conscious thought. He is actively thinking, if I am a jerk, this woman will be interested in me. It could also mean he is behaving in a way that would only make sense to me if it were true that he believes that if he behaves like a jerk, that woman will be more interested in him. So in other words, sometimes we're just saying the way you're behaving wouldn't make sense in this context, but would make sense if this was the case. And that's what we mean by think or want. So in this case, people mirroring the body language of someone they want to be on the good side of, we can think of that as, oh, I have a conscious want to be on this person's good side, and then conscious like attempts to mirror them. And certainly that does happen, especially because people learn about the concept and then they're like, oh, so this is a way that someone will like me more without, which isn't totally the case, but there is something to mirroring. It's just not about liking me more. It tends to go in that direction. But what's happening there is we're just observing that people mirror other people's body language. And then we're observing that that happens more often in the context in which it is a true statement, to the best of our ability to determine, to say that this person wants to be on that person's good side. Not that they actively are thinking that.
I always thought it was bizarre in my skills class for counseling, getting evaluated on our mirroring skills, as if I was consciously aware that I was mirroring or not.
Well, in therapy training, you are taught to mirror intentionally.
I'm not thinking about it. I just react to my client.
Yeah, well, so this is like acting, right? That the learning and the training and the work that you do is intended to be done so that when the moment comes, none of that shows. If that makes sense.
It does. I don't think it was shown when I was doing it, because I'm like, I've got acting training. I could mirror in my sleep. That's what I felt like.
You are mirroring to whatever extent you are at all times. Everybody is. It doesn't mean you're doing it every single moment, but you do it from time to time or in some ways or whatever. didn't like set the camera where I most want it to be, so I'm
Go set
leaning
it.
forward because
Move it.
I don't want to be like on the edge of the frame, but I'm not that far at the edge of this. That's why I'm like sitting so far forward, and I'm very aware of my body language as we're discussing body language.
Rough.
Okay. But your professors, in that case, what they meant by mirroring was some specific thing that they were looking to see. Whether or not you were doing what they were looking for is different from whether or not we can describe anything you're doing as being mirroring.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, likely you were doing mirroring to some extent. And what mirroring, this is all theoretical stuff, right? Like human beings are not machines. We can't look at like, oh, if we pull this lever, this result happens consistently every single time. We're looking at trends, we're looking at context, we're using logic and reasoning to fill in some gaps and make some guesses about things, and that's how we construct narratives. But they're always just narratives. So the idea of mirroring is not necessarily that it makes a person like you more, it's that it makes that person more comfortable with you.
I'm thinking about how when I was learning to do magic tricks, that I was convinced that because I knew, everyone else knew how to do the magic tricks too, and like I was giving it away somehow. And I'm thinking about spies, like if I trained to be a spy, I'd be thinking like, oh my gosh, they're aware of like everything too. I'm just like, my anxiety would just be the death of me.
So that is something called the spotlight effect.
We have that a lot here.
Psychology. The spotlight effect is everyone overestimates the extent to which other people are paying attention to them. Mm-hmm. Everybody feels like there's a spotlight on them when other people really aren't paying attention to them. And it doesn't, obviously that's not one-to-one. Like there are times when other people are paying attention to you. It's just overall, there's an assumption that other people pay attention to you more than they do, which I would say has something to do with projection, not projection, the defense mechanism, but projection, the way of like perceiving and understanding and interacting with the world, which is like you assume all other humans are the same as you unless you have some specific information to the contrary. So if I am aware that I'm a spy, I'm going to assume that everybody else is aware that I'm a spy unless I have some specific information or think some conscious thought that allows me to differentiate them from me in that way.
Sounds so simple.
We see this in like, this is research based too, not just experiential, right? A famous example of this is you take a child, and I can't remember what age, somewhere in that 4, 5, 6-year-old range, and put a box in front of them labeled Smarties. Mm-hmm. And you say, what do you think is in the box? And they say Smarties. And then you open it up and it's a rock or whatever. And they're like, so what's in the box? It's a rock. And then you say, if your friend, and then you close it again. You say, if your friend Stephanie or whatever saw this box, what do you think they would say is inside of it? And they say, a rock. Mm. Because perspective taking is a difficult cognitive task. It's something we learn to do. It takes experiences and information to come to the understanding that other people don't see things the way that I see them all the time.
That's a great example.
So we've done lots of experiments like this with kids, right? Where you'll show them a picture of a mountain and ask them questions about what it looks like to you, and then put another person in that picture with a different angle viewing it and ask what it looks like to them, and they say it's the same. Mm-hmm. Whatever. So yes, we just generally, we always are assuming, because assuming is one of those words that sounds like an active thing, but it's not. Mm-hmm. Assuming doesn't mean you had a conscious thought and you thought, yes, I think this is how it is, although we do that sometimes and we call that assuming. It also means like you are behaving as though this thing is the case. Right now we are behaving as though gravity is a constant and will not change. Mm-hmm. So it is accurate to say we are assuming that gravity is a constant and will not change. Are we thinking that consciously, like actively having that thought? No. But if we thought gravity might change, we would be behaving differently than we are. So there's all these words we use in two different ways. One is to mean a person is conscious, aware, effortfully doing or thinking a thing. Another is they're behaving in a way that would make most sense if it were true that whatever the thing, right? If you believe that dogs can fly, then even if you're not having a conscious thought of, I think dogs can fly, like when your dogs are getting very close to the edge of the cliff and you are unconcerned, we could say like, oh, they believe that dogs can fly. It's just theoretical, that version of it. It's just a narrative. So what mirroring is, like a lot of other things, is, and I'm not, this part I'm not sharing from like knowing research. There might be stuff about this out there, but I'm just sharing my way of thinking about it. It makes you more comfortable with the other person because, like we were talking about masking earlier, the more that you, the more effort you're putting toward like, how am I coming across this person to this other person, the more uncomfortable you are, right? Like putting effort into anything, even minor effort. Holding this mug here takes some amount of, I'm exerting some effort, right? It's not a lot. It's not going to hurt me. After enough time of doing it, eventually I'd start to get uncomfortable and painful, and I wouldn't be able to do it forever.
The lamest Survivor challenge ever.
So there's different levels of this, obviously, but anything that you're doing that requires effort is a thing that, by its very nature, even if doing it allows us to do something enjoyable, like I want to take a sip of my tea, and therefore the effort of raising the mug to my mouth doesn't bother me. I don't even think about it. I just think, ooh, nice cup of tea.
I feel like I have to look away from you sipping your tea.
Yeah, don't look at me while I'm drinking. Same thing with thinking about things, right? So like on a first date, even if you're really enjoying yourself and
everything,
you love it, right? Like you'd rather be able to do that than not have been able to do that. It's still very effortful because you're paying so much attention to trying to particularly notice, how is this person different from me?
On my first day here.
Yeah.
God.
Interview scenarios. I was listening to a Radiolab episode yesterday about aphantasia, and it was really interesting to me to hear them talking about how they first came up with a way to measure aphantasia. The end result of this conversation is we are more self-conscious. Interesting. I'm curious to know more about that. But there are things that I can do or you can do actively, like consciously, very noticeable, that might give somebody the impression that we are similar to them in some way. Oh, I also have 2 siblings or whatever, right? Like that's very noticeable.
Wrong.
But I was just trying to choose a first date thing.
Yeah.
At least I don't know why I chose that one.
Do you have 2 siblings?
Kind of. It's complicated.
Yeah, mine is 2.
That's why it's like,
oh my gosh, we have so much in common. Complicated sibling history.
Just make sure it's, the idea of that is that anytime that you start from a default assumption that we are the same, unless you have some specific information to believe that we are not. And then there are times where we believe that we're different, and it turns out that we are the same, right? Like the sibling question, as silly as it is, I'm not going to, because I'm conscious of that. I know that people have different amounts of siblings and whatever, especially if I have an unusual amount, right? I have 7 siblings or whatever. When I meet somebody, I'm going to assume that they don't have the same amount of siblings as I do. And in that point, when they say, oh, I also have 7 siblings, then it's coming back to,
I do.
Then it's coming back to like, oh, we are the same, right? So sometimes we think we are the same when we're different. Sometimes we think we're different when we're the same. But anything that gets communicated to me that we're the same makes me feel more comfortable with you. If I thought previously to that it's something we didn't have in common. The other, like, more subtle version of this is anything which prevents me from becoming aware that we are different from one another in any way that I don't already know is going to make me more comfortable with you. Or another way of saying that is anything that demonstrates to me that we are different from one another in a way that I didn't know makes me less comfortable with you. So mirroring, in that sense, it's kind of like if I were to dress the same as another person or use the same language as them, or anything that just allows me to continue to operate as though we are the same.
Brandon, I had a woman in high school, or a girl in high school, start dressing like me. Like every day it was a little bit different, and then her blog post started to look just like my blog posts and have like, the same song title quotes and things. And I was trying to test if my theory was correct, even though I knew it was. And so I bought a bunch of like hair color strips to clip in my hair to see like, okay, that's bizarre. Like it'll be really obvious if she starts like clipping her hair with like, but she was absent that entire week. I tried that trend.
So the end of that story is you don't actually know if she was
No, she was.
consciously,
I talked to her about it. I
Oh,
had a
okay.
discussion.
But that tested.
That tested no.
Sorry, the aphantasia thing was not meant to be a non sequitur. They were doing an experiment where they showed one eye a shape like a green square and the other eye is something like a red circle. And your brain reconciles the images by flipping back and forth between the two. If you are able to visualize things well in your head, if you think about a green square, you will suddenly only see the green square. If you can't visualize, you will keep flipping between the two.
But you're feeling between the two, you're seeing them still, right?
That's here's my initial thoughts to that, and maybe I'm not understanding it, or maybe there's some element of it that's not being communicated or that I'm misinterpreting. But as described, that sounds like an experiment designed with a particular theory in mind.
That's what I think every second here. Like,
yeah,
uh-oh.
It's a pretty common response to me. Uh-oh. That sounded sadder than it is. Uh-oh, Brandon has thoughts is not only because, oh, now Brandon has thoughts, but also because, like, I'm going to want to know those thoughts. So now I have to listen to them. You know? It's designed for a different experiment. So what's happening is all via self-report here, right? Like a person is reporting that either I am kind of noticing both things flipping back and forth, or I'm only noticing one of those things. So that right off the bat is something. Second, there's no element of that involves any like objective or empirical measurement of whether or not somebody is visualizing something. So to say that if someone can visualize well, they only see the green circle and not the red square, what that means is we have a theory that if some people visualize better than other people, the people who visualize better would be able to experience this result. There's nothing about that experiment that actually proves that hypothesis. It's just giving what we're saying is we notice that some people notice only the green square, or at least report noticing only the green square, or some people report noticing both flipping back and forth. Presumably, they have other, it's designed for a different experiment, the experimenter noticed the effect later. Presumably, they are measuring this against other things that they think of as proof that some people visualize better than others, right? Like that there's some other test or experiment that shows these people are better at visualizing things than these people, and then noticing a correlation between the people who are better at visualizing something report only seeing the green circle.
I'm stuck on what that means.
I was very quickly summarizing for the sake of not taking over the entire conversation.
Why, Brandon does it all the time.
Yeah, I get that, and I have no issues with how you're reporting it. Because here's what I would say, is like, we all see two images at the same time all the time, right? That's a particular version of it where we're making it very different. But that's the whole point of what focus is versus like blurriness and whatever. Like the reason that we can focus is because the brain is doing some really like intense calculations at all times, because we're taking two different images, calculating like against the musculature awareness of where the eye is pointed, and then calculating out where those two images connect and how distant that must be based on our awareness and experience of like how our eyes pointing in different slight differentiations like correlates to where something ends up being, right? Which, by the way, just a quick side note, visual data, like seeing, is a very cognitively draining activity, like way more than I think people tend to recognize.
Which is why I want to go to the eye doctor.
And yes, I will say I have certainly anecdotally noticed and logically believe that having any kind of like vision difficulty, if things are blurry to you and you don't have glasses, or what I have noticed with people frequently is they have glasses or contacts and for some reason lose them or aren't wearing them for some period of time. And then after a while, so this is when your vision is like off enough that it's noticeable and can be corrected by lenses, but not so much that it inhibits your ability to function and navigate the world, because you can go months. Like I went 2 years without my glasses at one point.
So you wear contacts now?
I do now, yeah.
I would never know.
Well, that's the point of contacts, I guess. They're
Yes.
invisible.
Thanks, Brandon.
I have noticed many times that people who do that in that intervening period where they don't have it are like way more tired and have a lot more emotional difficulties during that time. I'm assuming because of how much more tired they are. Of all the senses, it's like the most conscious and effortfully directed because it's directional in ways that touch and scent and taste and all those things aren't. It goes away when we're asleep, or as people, I mean, I know it's a dad joke, but I'm just resting my eyes. Like we do close our eyes as a way to like get centered and focused and whatever. Want to see the research? Actually, yes, I do. I don't have anything to write it down right now, but that's okay. I can, the chat is safe. You want to see the research? It's from Joel Pearson, professor of cognitive neuroscience at the University of New South Wales.
And Radiolab too, which I think I'm going to listen to.
Yeah, I would be interested to know more. So everyone has a dominant eye in the same way that you have a dominant hand.
News to me.
There's an easy test we can do to both prove this, but also as a way.
Right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Also as a way for each person to learn which eye is their dominant eye.
Let's go, team.
It's a fun little party tricky kind of thing, but it's actually, so take your hands, put them at full arm's length in front of you, cross them over one another so that there's just like a tiny little hole in between.
The little triangle?
Yeah. And then point at something, point that little triangle at something.
I squinted an eye.
Well, don't squint. Keep both eyes open.
Okay.
Point that at something so that the thing is like in that little triangle and that it occupies like the full space of it, more or less, right? And now, while keeping that thing centered in the space, in the triangle between your hands, while keeping that image centered, slowly bring your hands to your face. Make sure to keep it centered the whole way.
Mm-hmm.
Bring them all the way to your face.
Uh-huh.
Now, which eye did it end up over? That's your dominant eye.
Yeah, even when I was squinting, this eye stayed open. It was weird.
Yeah, it's just a matter of like efficiency, optimization, right? That in the same way that
I know.
I learned that from my grandpa when I was like
That's so cute.
8 or whatever. It's just like a party trick kind of a thing. You actually, when you know this, I hesitate to say this, but I'm going to say it. Just like fair warning.
No, I'm conscious of it now.
Once I say this, you will be aware of it and you'll notice it more. And it might bother you. Everybody's eyebrows are uneven.
Yeah.
And their eye sizes are different. Your dominant eye, that eyebrow is higher and that eye stays more open.
Oh my gosh, I'm thinking about pictures too, where I've been like self-conscious of that.
So you
It's
can,
funny.
when you just meet people, you can consciously, my cat's mouse toy taught me, my Tom, it's funny. You can consciously identify this and like recognize it. And there are theories. Some people have theories about what it might mean about people. I think that stuff is very specious, but I'm happy to share it if you want.
I never want to look at face again, Brandon.
But presumably this is something that even though you're not consciously aware of it, it has been playing into your read of people, your evaluation of them, right? In the way that when you look at someone's face, you're like, oh, they look sad. Even if you can't, like if you then were to close your eyes and someone says, what about their face made you read them as sad? You can't consciously identify like, oh, their eyes looked exactly, or, you know, it just is taken kind of, it's a Gestalt perception thing. You see it all at once and just interpret it. But presumably eyebrow height and dominant eye, if it is theoretically relevant the way that
Cover my
some
face.
people think it is. I mean, mine I believe, I'm not even sure this could be a spotlight thing, but I'm fairly confident that mine is a very extreme difference. That like my eyes are very lopsided compared to most people. The difference between the height and like even the size and shape of the eye, I think is very noticeable, but maybe other people don't. I don't know. My hairdresser believed the direction of your hair whirls said things about your personality. That is a not uncommon belief, including, if no one has heard this before, urban myth that that your hair whirls correlate to whether you are straight or gay. That if the part on the back of your head goes a certain way, then it means you're gay.
Could you imagine? Everyone lift their hair. Don't tell her about the eyebrow thing.
Anyway, so back to vision. What's actually happening at all times is you're seeing two images superimposed over one another. Again, another way to do that is like put your eye or your finger fairly close to your face and then just alternate closing one eye and then the other, and you'll see like, oh, that moves.
Classic 4-year-old activity.
Yeah, right? Because this is an inherently like interesting thing to discover.
Even my hair whirls aren't straight.
That's funny. And the dominant eye is the one that like, in the same way that activities which require like real intense training and or difficult like usage of a hand, but they only require one hand, just it makes the most sense to only train one hand that way, right? Like it's a waste of resources for a human body and mind and nervous system, whatever, to be like, no, I want to train both of my hands to be able to write with the same.
And so what do we say about ambidextrous? Like, is that just whatever? They're not even thinking about it? Like,
it depends on the context, because again, that gets used to refer to many different things.
Oh, does it?
Well, I mean, just different versions of like exactly what exactly does the gap have to be?
Sure.
What if I can write with both, but I still use a spoon in this hand, and this hand it's awkward, or you know. But presumably, theoretically, anybody could be trained to be able to write just as effectively with each hand.
That's a lot of effort.
But you would have to put in that much effort with each hand, and at the same time, you know, if you spend your whole childhood learning one and then you spend the next 10 years trying to learn the other, there's other differences.
Makes me think I got really good at reading upside down being a preschool teacher.
Preschool teacher, yes. My Susan taught kindergarten for 7 years, and she's really great at writing upside down.
Yes, I was going to say that too.
And drawing upside down.
The writing upside down.
So presumably anyone could be trained to do it. Theoretically, I think that stuff is generally talked about as though it is like just something that you're born with your brain being wired a certain way, but that's absurd because we're talking about learned behaviors. Like you're not born knowing how to write. You learned how to write. Would you
say that then? Like, even though they say like being left-handed is genetic? Like it's...
Well, it's not that they're...
Talk to me, Brandon.
Okay, so we know for a fact with this particular example, because it, for a long period of time in our culture, it was considered bad to be left-handed. And so when a child started to display left-handedness, left-hand dominance, they would bind the left hand and force the child to use the right hand, and they'd end up being right-hand dominant. So we know for a fact that even if there is some natural inclination, we can make it be the other way. That's one of the things that is often used in arguments, particularly about transness and like how many more more people are identifying as trans, is that if you graph over time the occurrence of left-handedness in a population, there's this huge gap where like people stopped forcing left-handed kids to become right-handed, and all of a sudden it shoots up to 10%. And so that's one of the arguments is like there's more people identifying as being trans because it's less dangerous to do so than it used to be, which doesn't mean it's not dangerous, etc. I learned to be able to type with only my non-dominant hand because my cat kept trying to sleep on my laptop, and I had to use one hand or the other to keep him awake, and he would fall asleep on that hand as close to the keyboard as he could get, fast as a heat-seeking missile. That's funny. Yeah, learning typing is a good example of some of this stuff. I learned typing in 7th grade. I learned home row typing in a class.
I learned in 2nd grade.
Well, I'm older, right? So like typing was there's a movie that I don't actually like, but I saw a long time ago called Black Hawk Down. It's set in like 1992 or whatever. And one of the few things that sticks in my memory from that movie is that one of the guys in the army works in the office because he has a special skill set, and his special skill set is that he can type. Like that's just it's not a thing that people generally could do back then.
You have to write how many words you can write per minute. It was like in job.
Right. So like now I work with clients who are like coders and programmers. You know, they type on a computer for their job and for their hobby. They've always been interested in that. And they do like 2 fingers on each hand, or like kind of hunt and peck or whatever. Where like optimally, obviously, using all 5 fingers on, or 4 fingers and a thumb, I don't know how you count it, on each hand is going to be able to go faster than using 1 or 2. No matter how good you get at this, you could be faster if you used more fingers. But people start using keyboards at a much younger age before we have the opportunity to train them to do it in the most optimal way.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like sometimes left-handed people will learn how to play guitar on right-handed guitars.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you give them a left-handed guitar, all of a sudden, like all the chord shapes are inverted and they can't do it.
Weird.
So yeah, a lot of this is about learned behavior. But anyway, the thing about that, and I did want to read the research and look into the experimentation there, is that everybody sees 2 overlapping images, and your dominant eye takes precedence when those images are overlapping. You know, when it is not necessary or when it becomes important or whatever to preference one of those over the other, the dominant eye is the one that gets preference.
I'm gonna be doing this shit all day.
That's why when you do that thing, you start with it far enough away where your eyes can converge and both are seeing the image. But by the time it gets to your face, obviously only one eye can be seeing it. So without knowing what's going on, you are unknowingly bringing it to your dominant eye, and the other one's getting blocked by the hand.
Mm-hmm.
And there theoretically could be distinctions in like some version of what we call ambidexterity, right? That like some people, the skill gap between what I can do with this hand versus this hand is going to be smaller. They'll perform more similarly than other people. The skill gap would be the same. Could be true, almost definitely is true of eyes for various reasons. That like some people, the dominant eye is like not that much more.
I'm thinking about how I cartwheel with my left hand, even though I'm right-handed, but it's this side that's stronger, and that's the one that's closer.
See, a lot of this stuff is just like theories and narratives, right? Like, do we know?
I want to keep it.
Anything?
I want to keep it. I like this narrative.
So how would we control for something like that? Because when you're actually seeing this, it's not likely. It's not how the brain processes visual data, right? It's not that I see a green circle and then a red square and then a green circle and then a red square and I flip back and forth between the 2. It's that I'm seeing 2 overlapping images, one of which has a little bit more preference than the other for whatever reason. And there are theoretically things we could do to make it so that the other one would take precedence and switch back and forth in that way. But you're still getting that visual data. You don't completely block it out. And just seeing the green square or green circle or whatever could then just be viewed as a version of like a way to make that one take predominance for a longer period of time than the other one. And whether or not that correlates to some ability to internally visualize something, I mean, we'd still have to have some way to be able to determine whether or not people can, like whether there's a skill gap or whatever in how well people can visualize something. And that relies on self-report.
We don't have like brain scans that can like see.
No. So it relies on self-report. It relies on how people say they can visualize something, and that is filtered through language. And as we're talking about like how much language I'm using and how like whatever, just to try and be precise about the difference between visual data, you know, like light hitting the rods and cones versus perception or whatever. Like people don't generally have information about this. And so when you say, what do you see versus what do you visualize, whatever, like the simple fact that nobody sees anything in their mind, because sight, by what we're talking about, requires visual, like light hitting your rods and cones. what you're doing is conceptualizing something, and you can conceptualize a symbol that appears to be visual to you or in some way is related to or similar to how you perceive things that originate in visual data. But there is a meaningful distinction between I'm perceiving something that light is bouncing off of it into my eyes versus I'm just thinking about that thing. In other words, if a person truly could not visualize something in their mind, they would be blind. The perception requires that you are creating a visual construct or a construct in your mind that correlates to some visual thing. So aphantasia doesn't mean that that's not real. It just means that that's not what it means for sure. And I have not looked into it enough to know what exactly in technical terms that means. But it cannot mean that a person cannot conceptualize things in visual terms, or utilizing
Are you looking for things
symbolic
right now?
and abstract representation. Huh?
Were you looking for things with your eyes closed?
No.
They were very close for a very long time.
I was just, I don't know, talking about visualizing things. I would say that I don't tend to, at least as far as I notice, I don't notice myself defaulting to like what I would call visual memories or thoughts, but I don't notice it being auditory either.
When I was little and I would close my eyes, I would always see the same visual, which was like the Rugrats characters. Like that was just like my default. That's what my brain would like think of.
Rugrats characters?
Yeah, and sometimes
Interesting.
still as an adult, I'll close my eyes and I'll see that same visual. I have no idea.
It sounds like imprinting almost.
Imprinting?
One particular episode of Rugrats that, like, when I think of it, still has emotional resonance for me. It's when Chucky gets a girlfriend on the playground, and then like gets, so has a new boyfriend the next day, and his heart's broken. The things that stick with us.
Emotional resonance for you?
Yeah, like other people, certainly as therapists, especially, will talk about this in different ways, but talk about like bring up a memory that contains something or evokes something in it that like you don't identify as being contained in that memory. I feel like I do visualize things a little bit, mostly in a kind of abstract way. Yeah, that's the point. Anything that happens in the mind is abstract.
Yeah.
The mind can only deal with abstract concepts. There's no such thing as seeing something in terms of like that in your mind you have visual data in there. You don't. You have an abstract concept that theoretically, when it's that we're seeing something that is built on top of or impacted by visual data that hits your rods and cones, but then that's turned into electrical signals that go along the optic nerve and is perceived as something different than, because we can do some experiments with this, right? Like someone can say, oh, I think visually or whatever, or I see images in my mind. But those images, you cannot interact with them the same way that you can interact with actual images. For example, with an actual image that exists in the environment, if I say zoom in or get closer to a certain part, you can, because it is based on static data. But if you're visualizing something in your mind and I say zoom in, you can switch to a different image that contains some element of that initial image, but at a closer level. But you don't experience the same transition of, no, I'm just getting closer and closer without anything changing aside from relative size and position.
There's a great video game. Oh, where like you're a patient in a coma, and so like
Superliminal.
Superliminal, yes. Yeah. That's
cool
what I was
game.
thinking of. Yeah, very cool game.
Yeah, the premise is that you're undergoing, I forget what they call it in the game, but a particular experimental version of therapy that puts you into a dream state in order to get you to like manipulate your concept of perception.
Yeah, that's all I was thinking when you were mentioning that.
Yeah, Superliminal is a cool game. It takes a second to get into, I think.
Yes.
Like they didn't do the learning curve, I think, quite right. Like it's real slow, like do this, then do this. And so I stopped the first time I started playing it. I stopped after a couple minutes because like, oh my gosh, this is so
right. It's repetitive and
but if you get through that, it's pretty cool. And not just the like gameplay, although puzzle solving and whatever can be cool, but literally like it's one of the few games that the things that they're saying are intriguing. You know,
Mhm.
like that the game is trying to mess with your perception and it knows that it's doing that and it's talking about how it's messing with your perception. But I would say I don't think it would be very interesting or fun or enjoyable for people who do not play video games regularly
Yeah.
because you don't have those If you watch someone try to do dual joystick control, meaning one joystick moves you and one controls where you're looking,
Mhm.
which is like the default setting for most games these days, console games, obviously. Well, I guess computer games similar. They just don't use joysticks. They use
I always
mouse
struggle
and
with that.
keyboard. If you watch somebody who is not like used to that, trying to play a game like that, they're just running into walls all over the place because the brain does take training to be able to translate two-dimensional data into three-dimensional concepts. It's interesting, at the end of the Radiolab episode, they talked to a guy with what they called really high levels of visualization, and he could like project the image on the real world.
Huh.
And when other things started going really badly in his life, he started becoming unable to tell the difference between what he was visualizing in real life. Okay, so to the extent that a person is able to project a visualization, which what we mean by that is an abstract concept, onto the real world, more thoughts. Yeah. All we're really saying there is that that person is making less of a distinction between abstract representation of visuals that are based on actual light entering the eye versus ones that are not based on that.
Is that a skill set?
No, that's hallucination,
Yeah.
which is in the very next thing, right? Like when things go really badly in his life, he starts becoming unable to tell the difference. But that's
Oh,
what he was
no.
doing before. Projecting the image onto the real world is just another way of saying he's treating something in his mind as though it is
Fascinating.
conceiving something that originates in his cognition as though it originates in the environment when it doesn't. And he's logically maintaining separation, right? Presumably, I'm guessing at what he means by projecting it onto the real world. Is that what he's saying is like, oh, it's like I see it right here, right? But he's using logic to dictate that this thing that I see as though it actually is in the environment is not actually in the environment because I know for whatever reason I'm using logic and memory to deduce that I put it there. It's not actually there. But in any time that I don't have that logic, I don't have that memory, I'm not able to like reference somebody else, hey, do you see this thing? Then how do I know it's there or not if I see it the same? You can originally always tell the difference. So what I'm saying is if that is a skill, and I believe that it likely is a very dangerous one because you have to be able to, you can't rely on the like coherence of the visual or the experience of it, knowing like that you're perceiving it and experiencing it in some way that is different in some way than how you experience something that originates in the environment, and are just relying on cognition to tell the difference. And that cognition will fail you. Sometimes you'll get tired or you won't know. And I mean, to the extent that this is true, meaning if this is a 100% true statement about what he's experiencing, how would he or we ever determine that he has identified all of the things that weren't real?
Mm-hmm.
Like if he experiences seeing a cognitively constructed image, if he experiences that the same way that he experiences seeing an image that is built off of light coming into the eye, how could we ever go through his life and identify like, oh, those leaves you saw on the tree were actually there. These other leaves, your mind just filled in, which is in a sense what everybody does, right? Like you look at a tree and then you look away. What leaves did you actually see versus what is it? Like another thing that if you go on TikTok, people will sometimes be like, if you're one of the people who has this experience as though it's a rare one, but it's a universal one, third person memories. Pull up a memory of you at a party. Is that memory, if I tell you to visualize it, make an image of it, is that image from the first person perspective of where you were standing in that moment? Likely not. Likely you're seeing it from like an isometric or outside perspective where you might not be seeing yourself in the party, or you might, but you're still definitely not seeing that moment through the eyes.
I flip-flop.
There are some memories where you do. but some you don't. They brought it up as an example of how being able to visualize things clearly is not always a good thing. I don't know why there would even be a presumption that it is a good thing.
So there's some benefit to implementation.
All right, this actually relates to something that's been on my mind tonight. This need that we have in our culture, need is a strong word. This tendency we have in our culture to map everything onto a spectrum of good or bad. There's this default assumption that anything that we identify as being a thing is good or bad or somewhere in between. And we can understand nuance that like it can be good in some situations and bad in others, but we still treat it as though it exists on that spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is whenever we come up with new ideas or become aware of new concepts or new experiences, we just automatically kind of locate it on that spectrum based on any number of cues that we could not consciously identify what they all are. But because we are calling it aphantasia, which the construct of that word, a as a prefix, means the lack of or the inability to or whatever, right? So just the way that we've constructed that word, we're centering the ability to visualize things in a particular way, as though there is like some way to even if there's something to all this, which there's definitely something to all this because people are reporting it, the idea that we could categorize it into two categories of you do or you don't is absurd. Even the people who study it would not say that. They'd say it's a spectrum. So we're just constructing concepts and using like, but calling it aphantasia, what we're saying is that the default and what most people experience is this, and if you experience this other thing, you're different. And because we associate different with bad, which is a logical association. Obviously not always true, but it is logical to think if most humans are a certain way, we can assume that there's some benefit to being that kind of a way. We are wired to treat deviation from patterns as noteworthy and potentially problematic for good reason, right? Like if the weather is the same weather every kind of blah, 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 and then one day it's different, you notice it more because like, oh, let's pay attention to this. It doesn't always mean bad, but there's reasons to start with that assumption and work from there. Certainly a lot easier and better than starting with the other assumption that same is bad, because if you thought same was bad, you'd have to pay attention to everything all the time. It's like just over the last 3 minutes, that couch has not changed at all for us to have the assumption that the lack of change is concerning or noteworthy. Mm-hmm. We could never stop paying attention to anything. So just the nature of how it works. So then it's like some big revelation when it's like, hey, this thing that we've all been talking about it like it's bad is actually not all bad. There are some benefits to it. Of course there is. There must be by some definition, because where this started, whatever this concept refers to, where it starts is we're observing, theoretically, I'm just going to go with the aphantasia is what people say it is and whatever for this, right? That some people visualize this way, some people visualize this way, or not at all, or whatever. We didn't make up that concept, right? We observed it. We observed that some people say this is how I visualize things. Some people say, oh, I don't visualize things at all. So it's a thing that naturally occurs at some level, like some level of significance that it's notable, not just like a person. We're connecting some dots, meaning there have to be enough instant. So that's how humans are, that some experience this way, some experience it that way. The default presumption at that point is that there are trade-offs in that thing, that there are contexts in which doing it this way is beneficial and contexts in which doing it this way is detrimental, and same with any other way. So when we then impose on top of that, hey, we noticed this thing where people vary. In other words, it would kind of be like let's talk about height, because that's observable and everybody knows it. We all know that humans vary in height, but it would kind of be like somebody being like, wait, I've started to notice that some people, the top of their head is 6 feet or more from the bottom of their feet, and other people, the top of their head is less than 6 feet from the bottom of their feet. And I'm going to start talking about this as like having height or lacking height. You either have or don't have height. And then everyone's going to say like, okay, well, having height is better because we're calling it having height.
So some people do that.
Well, yes, that's part of the reason I'm choosing this example, because it does have this
Mhm.
correlation culturally. But anything where we say you have a thing or don't have a thing, like this is one of my big problems with people calling it giftedness and then complaining about everyone thinks giftedness is just beneficial, that there are no downs. Calling it
Gifted.
having a gift, like the language implied.
Yeah.
Like, would you rather have a gift or not have a gift? Of course, people are going to come to the conclusion that it's a good thing to have and a bad thing not to have it. But just generally, unless we're talking about disease, for the most part, if we're labeling something as you have it or you don't, we wouldn't have called it that, except that we already were centering the having it version.
Mm-hmm.
So now we got people, some people have height, some people don't. And everyone's just kind of assuming that having height is good and not having height is bad. And it bleeds into our conversations and our culture until somebody starts to say, like, actually, I'm not sure that not having height is always a bad thing. There might be some benefits to it. But of course, there are benefits to it, or we wouldn't vary that way in the first place. If it was always beneficial, globally beneficial to be a particular way, then evolution would dictate that all of us are that way, except for pathological variation, because there is injury and illness. There are cases where, for whatever reason, people deviate from, but it is pathological, it's unintentional. Any other variation, natural variation that is just baked in, it must be built on top of the idea that there are benefits to being each of those ways and downsides to being each of those ways. So yes, aphantasia. But here's another one that I've been sending an article around to people, because some people, it's just so much easier for them to get concepts if they have it from like a scientific article rather than just Joe Schmo Brandon telling them something. That there are evolutionary advantages to forgetting things, which like is frustrating to me, because obviously there are. Otherwise, why would we forget stuff? If there was no benefit to forgetting anything, why would humans forget things? We are centering a particular experience,
Mm-hmm.
and there's obvious reasons for that, right? Mostly when we're talking about, oh, I didn't remember something, we're talking about, for some reason, something has happened that called my attention to something in the past where, had I remembered something at that moment that I did know before, things would have gone in some way that I would prefer to now.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, we all forget the vast majority of everything we know and
So
everything
much.
we experience. We just don't think about that. That's the point of forgetting. It's only when something like, hey, did you get that thing? Oh, I forgot. So we only think about forgetting in the instances in which, had we remembered, it would have been beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
So of course we label forgetting as a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
Same with distraction, for example. We center this idea of focus. Either of these are real things, but they're labels we apply to real experiences. And then we have to go through this whole process of being like, hey, maybe there's some advantage to doing that thing that all humans do. Obviously there's an advantage to that, or why would we do it? And yes, for forgetting stuff. Remembering something is the opposite of creating something. You cannot innovate if you remember. Does that make sense?
A little.
If you come to a problem, let's say there's a keypad and you've got to enter a 4-digit code, and you know that code and you remember it, you just enter the code and you move on. If you don't remember the code, then you have to pay more attention to be like, oh crap. And you can try some different things and try and come up with stuff, but you can also then start to be like, maybe there's some other way to unlock this,
Mm-hmm.
or is there some other way to get this door open without unlocking this, or to get in there without using this door, or is there some other way to accomplish whatever I'm trying to accomplish by getting in there? Like, the opposite of remembering a solution is creating a solution.
It's like me trying to learn to sew. I'm like, don't know how to do it, just gonna figure it out. I'm not remembering anything. I'm just doing.
I mean, yeah, creativity and memory, they don't, like, I'm talking about them in a specific way. Obviously, like, in order to create in the sense of like writing a story, I have to remember words,
Mhm,
or, you know, like they play together, but we can put them at opposite ends of the spectrum. and this does very much play into neurodivergence, including autism and ADHD and all these other things, that like there are upsides and downsides to remembering stuff. There are upsides and downsides to forgetting stuff. There are upsides and downsides to getting a very narrow focus. There are upsides and downsides to being what we would refer to as distracted, which means my attention is going different ways. And if we treat them as though it's just a downside and it's a problem to solve or overcome or circumvent, then we miss out on all the benefit of it. So yeah, colloquially a way of saying this that I do with people all the time is you can try to be a normie and be really bad at it. Like it'll be really effortful and uncomfortable for you to behave that differently from your like default way of behaving. And you're just never going to be as successful at it as people for whom that is closer to their default way of behaving. Or you can be a really successful version of you and just be the best person in the world at being who you are. And that's like language that I use to be effective, but don't generally do here because it doesn't contain real like information there. It's just, it's evocative and can evoke, elicit certain responses. But if you are a certain way that is a result of non-pathological variation, then by definition, there are advantages to being that way, or that would not happen. This is why it's a problem when we pathologize things that aren't pathological. It's not about stigma, or it's at least not just about stigma. That also is a problem. But if I consider being a certain way as the result of a pathology, then I consider it to be worthless, useless, only downside.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if I think of it as the result of a natural, non-pathological variation, then I know that there's some advantage to it. And even if I'm not aware of it or it doesn't seem like it, I know that that's just about how I'm perceiving it or how I'm labeling it, because there must be some upside, and I can find it, I can tap into it and use it.
So many moments in my life like this. I'm thinking about D&D and Aphantasia, and how when I first started watching, I was like, they're giving all this description at the beginning of what the world looks like and blah 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 blah, and I'm like, I'm not gonna remember anything they just said, and I was judging myself so hard for not being able to retain all the information provided, and they took so much time to be so descriptive, and like kept thinking something was wrong with me because I couldn't.
That's funny.
Stay with it.
It's funny because like I'm assuming that you have seen many plays in your life.
Yeah.
And I'm going to guess that never once did you think like, oh, I can't remember every word the actor just said.
No.
That means I'm missing out on something.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or like seeing a painting and being like, oh, I'm not remembering every detail of that painting.
But that's why I like watching the gameplays, because then I see like the actors like embody it, and then I have something to attach it to. But if I'm just listening, I'm like freaking out.
Except the point of art is not that you remember it.
Yeah.
Who cares if you remember the
Yeah.
details of that world or that campaign or what that actor said? The point is that you have an experience of it.
That's why me after movies, I'm like, can't talk to anybody because I don't remember what I just watched. I just remember what I felt.
Yeah, so this is something that happens for people who are predisposed to cognition, that we approach everything through a cognitive and intellectual lens.
How am I predisposed to it? How does that happen?
Oh, well, same with all this other stuff. We can say, and it might even be true, that there are correlations with genetic or biological factors, but even if that's the case, there's training involved.
Yeah.
Response to stimuli over time.
Me observing people talking after movies and thinking, I have to be one of those people.
Sure, but also like making assumptions about what the nature of that conversation is, or making assumptions about what the aim of it is. Like even if you're assuming that that conversation involves people talking about what they remember about the movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You're also on top of that assuming that at least somewhat the aim of that conversation is for each person to do that conversation correctly to impress the other people or for whatever reason. Because even if you're assuming that it is about saying what you remember, if you don't think that the point of the conversation has anything to do with doing it right or impressing people, then you could still pop in and be like, this is what I'm thinking, even though I don't remember anything.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of things. We can break anything down in like infinite ways. That's the point of anything conceptual, anything abstracted, because it's conceptual, because it is abstract, it's theoretical, constructed, whatever. It's not real. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist or doesn't have relevance or doesn't point at something that is a real experience. But by definition, something which is abstract is a concept. It is not the real thing, even if it's connected to a real thing. So we cannot ever quantify it or break it down. It is not a finite thing. That's part of my issue with the aphantasia stuff. It, by definition, cannot be quantified. That doesn't mean that it's not useful to explore the ways in which people vary, because they definitely do, and we can talk some about that. That definitely happens, but there's this second. Oh, there's a.
Yeah, go ahead.
I understand if I wished on a monkey's paw to have a better memory, it will definitely go horribly wrong, but that doesn't mean I wouldn't be tempted. Honestly, the monkey's paw or the literal genie, you know, like these narratives that exist in many different cultures over the history of human, where it's like, be careful what you wish for. I mean, a great modern example of that is It's a Wonderful Life. I think a lot of what those narratives, those like tropes and whatever are meant to convey, or why we resonate with them, is just that we all know two things. That what I'm saying about like abstract and construct and like anything that involves conscious thinking and the mind, so understanding and knowledge and whatever, that while those things can be useful, that's different from the real world.
Mm-hmm.
And B, that we cannot ever actually fully understand the ways in which any of our concepts or awarenesses or ideas play into everything else. That the universe and everything that happens is complicated beyond the capacity of any person to understand all the implications. So we have all these kind of stories and art and whatever, where it's like, you're only looking at this part of it and you're accurately identifying that things would be better for you if this thing changed, but there's all this other stuff that would also change that you're not thinking about as being relevant or impacted by that you would not like it. A lot of this, I mean, has to do with gratitude, being present in the moment, you know, feeling as though what you have is enough. It's it's one of the most, I would say, universal through lines of all like spiritual practices for humans, is this concept of connectedness to reality, like making space for whatever consciousness and whatever is,
Mm-hmm.
but being aware of and grateful for and paying attention to the actual real world around you as well,
Mm-hmm.
with very specific exceptions or like ascetic lifestyles of some people who do dedicate their whole life to being distant from that, but that's all about sacrificing. Anyway, so yes, there's all kinds of things. Oh man, my life would be better if this thing were to be true. Unless we're talking in observable terms, right? Like something that's empirically observable. My life would be better if I didn't have the flu right now. That's an observable thing. But anytime we're talking about abstract concepts, my life would be better if I was more brave. My life would be better if I was more focused, whatever. Like we're talking about human constructs, pattern, labels we've identified to attach to patterns of things that by definition are just our ways of thinking about it and talking about it. And because it's not real, we couldn't actually, if we can't quantify what it even means to be more brave, we certainly can't identify all the ways in which that would impact your life and your experience. So this is a big part of like the issue, I think, with therapy for many people these days, is that these abstract concepts, these constructs, including even the diagnoses, ADHD and whatever, are thought of as though they are real. And they are in the sense that many people often mean it, of like, I am really having these experiences. There are really differentiations between different people's patterns of how they think and feel and behave and how they respond to different contexts and environments. But then the concept that we come up with is just an abstract concept, a label that we're using to conceptualize, to symbol, like to represent the thing that is real. The concept itself is not real. It just, a finger that's pointing at the moon is not the moon.
Mm-hmm.
The moon is real, but the finger that's pointing at it, which is also real, is not the same as the thing it's pointing at.
Mm-hmm.
The concepts, even the diagnoses, are signs that point at real things. They themselves are not the thing, and everyone keeps making that mistake in our culture. And this impacts therapy because people think it is true that it could be like, I just need to repair my attachment style or whatever. I just need to learn to heal from my shame or whatever. And those are signs that point at real and useful things, but they're just signs, and people don't think that they are. So people come in saying, I just need to do this. And we say, well, what's the point? What is that pointing at? And people haven't explored it. So they don't know what they're really talking about. And everyone just thinks that there's like a way to be a healthy, happy person. And all you got to do is identify the things that are stopping you from that and fix those things in some nebulous way. And then you'll be a healthy, happy person. But healthy and happy are both also concepts. Look, here's my issue with this stuff, is that for the most part, I assume that I'm not like discovering something that the actual researchers and people who know this stuff very deeply have not considered. Like, that would be pretty absurd that they have never in all their work on this considered that visualization is a conceptual experience. I'm assuming that they know that. And I'm assuming that the research that they do is built with that in mind, right? What bothers me is that for many reasons, certain systems are structured in certain ways that incentivize talking about this stuff in unhelpful ways, where I believe that many of these researchers willfully abdicate the responsibility of acknowledging that what they say is going to be interpreted based on what they say, not based on what they believe and what they know. There's no happiness. Everything is a social construct. We live in a simulation called society. I mean, any of those could be an accurate statement because happiness, social construct, simulation, and society are all constructs. So we can make it mean anything we want it to mean. So depending on what you mean, sure. But we can take this to an extreme. I assume that the common understanding people have of what aphantasia is or what alexithymia is not what the researchers themselves would say. I assume that they have identified the same flaws in that I have identified, and probably a bunch that I haven't. They've spent way more time on it. But then they go out into the world and they write these books and these articles and they go on podcasts and they communicate in a way that is, whether they are consciously intending to or not, is constructed to be sensational. I assume that there are many people who are not doing that, either consciously and intentionally being clear not to do that and be sensational, or just failing to be sensational even though they're
What do you mean
wanting
when you
to.
say sensational?
What I mean is attention grabbing.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Like William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate from the early 20th century, when asked what makes something news, said that it's about what doesn't usually happen, right? That dog bites man, that happens every day. That's not news. Man bites dog, that's news. So there's this inverse correlation between how much we hear about something and how much it actually occurs. And we end up thinking that there are things that we hear about all the time and therefore we think are very common, but the actual point of the reason that they go talked about all the time is because they're very rare. And vice versa, stuff that we never hear about and therefore we think is very rare is actually really common. This plays into therapy, certainly, and a lot of these diagnoses, right? That like so much of what each of us individually is experiencing that brings us to therapy is actually a universal experience or a very, very common experience, but we never hear about it, so we assume that it is not and that we're the only ones or one of the very few. Some people deliberately play on that, right? Like I mentioned, there are TikTok videos where they're like, some people experience this and some people don't, where it's no, if you ask like real experts that study it, would say it's universal, or a lot of the stuff you can just logically be like, no, that cannot be true, right? Like some people forget stuff and some people don't. Like obviously that's not true. And they might be talking about something that is more nuanced than that, and that there's truth to that. Like, people forget certain kinds of things in certain contexts at a different rate than other people do. But when we hear somebody saying that, like, in certain contexts, some people will remember this thing at this rate and other people remember it at that rate. We're like, okay, fine, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
If anything, like, sure, yeah, that's obvious.
Right.
But when someone's like, some people don't forget things, you're like, what, for real?
Right.
Because I forget stuff. There are people who don't.
Right.
And then you go and you tell your friends, you're like, did you know some people don't forget stuff? And I'm picking an obviously silly example, but like, that's the aphantasia. Even if the common concept of aphantasia is exactly what people tend to think it is, that some small amount of people lack the ability to visualize things in their mind the way that most people can. Even if that's true, why are we all talking about it so much?
Mhm.
Presumably it's a very small number of people that impacts. So why are we talking about it so much? Except that it's like, for real? Because either that's not my experience, so that's
Mhm.
strange that happens, or okay, that's my experience. That's what I've been trying to tell people, and now I have a word that I can communicate. Either I identify with that term or I don't. If I don't,
Mhm.
that's very interesting to me, and I want to talk about it. Did you know some people don't have an inner monologue, which is another real thing that people talk about? You know, some people don't have an inner monologue, and depending on how I think about what inner monologue means and how I value it, I can be like, for real?
I love the character you put on for that.
Because for many of us, doesn't have an inner monologue means does not think thoughts.
Mhm.
And we're like, really? There are people who don't think thoughts? No, there are not people who don't think thoughts. Or at least we don't have evidence that there are. There theoretically could be. That's the philosophical zombie thought experiment we talked
Oh
about.
my lord.
But there's no reason to believe that there are not. Everybody reports that they think thoughts. Nobody's like, I don't think, unless they have a complete misconceptualization of what we mean by the word think in that question, right? Like, that's a language issue, not a what they're experiencing. I think we have to be careful talking about things that way, though, because most of the people I know with mental health issues spend a lot of time worrying about how maybe they're just exaggerating and everyone struggles the way they do. Yes, I agree, and that's part of there are some problems that are built on deeper problems, and there's not really a way to resolve the problem we're discussing without addressing the underlying problem, if that makes sense. Meaning, like, all right, to take a very, this is the first, I'm trying to think of a different one because this is such a controversial one, but I think we can use it as a good example.
Mhm.
There's so much controversy about participation of trans women in athletics. And it's not a debate that's going to be going away anytime soon. Because even people, as I consider myself to be, even those of us who are like trans inclusive and very supportive and allies, right? A lot of the time, the argument that those people are making is like, this is an overblown problem. It doesn't happen at a rate that people are pretending it does. It certainly is not worth like damaging or harming or constraining trans people in any kind of meaningful way just to offset the fact that like one person did this one thing one time. But the thing about that argument is that it doesn't address the fact that like it actually relies on the premise that that is in some way a bad thing, that if trans women were to win in women's athletics at like some significant rate, that it would be a problem that we need to address or whatever. The problem there is built on a larger problem about how we treat the significance of athletic competition. But as long as we treat athletic competition as being meaningful and significant in the way that we do, there is an unaddressable issue there of, there's a reason, for example, that we split off men's and women's athletics in the first place, because there are theoretically bias. And it does not mean that, I want to be real clear that I'm not using any of these dog whistles where like, if a trans woman competes, she'll just naturally beat all the cis women, or that there's an inherent advantage, or that no cis woman could ever defeat a trans woman. Like, none of that is true, obviously. But it is also true that our society has, like, without really batting an eye, any of us has just accepted that men's and women's athletics should be separated in some way for some reason, right? It's a stupid non-issue to me, but only because we venerate athletic competition in a way that really is nonsensical. I mean, it makes sense given the context. People made reasonable and rational decisions all along the way, but we're treating it in a way that creates this other inherent problem. So in other words, yes, mental health, the concept of mental health and the concept of diagnoses and the constructs of diagnoses, all of that is useful no matter what, society or not, whatever. Like having some way to be able to conceptualize and discuss our experiences, particularly noted patterns of experiences that are uncomfortable or harmful or problematic to us, always inherently going to be useful. Given the nature of how our culture is constructed, it is additionally useful to have an official way of doing it. You know, to be able to utilize diagnosis codes based on the DSM in order to provide to insurance or whatever. And all of that is based on the concept of justification, that there is some way you should be, and that if you are not that way, it is bad. For some reason other than just your experience of it being uncomfortable or painful, it is bad. And some, you know, you can be totally fine with it, but it's bad, right? When we treat things that way, then it is very useful and very important to be able to use justification. We're requiring justification, right? All people feel this way. Well, I don't feel that way, so what the hell is wrong with me? Well, some people feel this way, and those people are kind of this kind of people. Depressed people feel this way, and that matches how, oh, thank goodness. It's relief, like we're talking about, right? Like it's not just me, I'm not alone with it. But the funny thing is, like, we're conflating a few different things. We're mixing a few different things together. If there is benefit to no longer feeling alone with it, then theoretically there's even more benefit in that specific way to understanding it as universal, right? Not just, oh, there are some few other people like me, but everybody experiences this. If feeling less alone with it, if feeling like how I'm feeling doesn't make me weird and different, that others feel it too, then knowing that everybody feels it would make me feel that much better than knowing that 10% of people feel it. But there are other things that we still want to be different based on all this, right? That like, no, it can't be that everybody feels it the way that I feel it, because everybody has been saying all along that they feel it this way. And so if it turns out that what they're describing is the same as what I'm experiencing, then I'm back to square one, where it's like, well, it sounds like everybody else likes it and thinks it's good, and I'm miserable, and what am I doing wrong? So we need to distinguish it out as, you're not the only one, but you are one of the few. You are one of a minority that experience it that way. And again, that's useful. That's great. But when we're doing it that way, it causes problems, even though it is a good, and I would say even the best solution available to most of us for some problems. It causes additional problems. Like if, for example, I believe that the way that I am feeling, let's go with depression again, right? If I embrace this concept that depression is a disease, it is a medical thing. Some people's brains are just wired in certain ways and they have a chemical imbalance. And there's nothing you can do about it except take medication. You didn't choose it. It's not a matter of willpower or whatever. That also means that I'm saying that it is not a matter of context or environment or exposure to various stimuli. That I'm building all this on a premise that the way that people feel, at least in some instances, and I'm including myself in this definition, that the way that I feel is categorically removed. It is separate from anything outside of me. That how I feel is about what's going on in my brain and has nothing to do with what I just saw or what someone said or what I felt or anything else. That brings a lot of relief at first, because again, the whole point is I'm saying like, what's wrong with me? Oh, now I know what's wrong with me. And what we're doing is we're identifying it's not something I chose, and it's not something I can just choose to experience differently. Those two concepts are important to understand. I didn't just choose to be this way, and I can't change it just by choosing to be different. Those are important. But we've locked those two things behind this biodeterminism thing, meaning like the only way that it can be true that you didn't choose it and you can't choose to be different is if it has always been and will always be unimpactable. That it's just, it was your genes. There's nothing that can be done except for medical or biological intervention. And that is obviously untrue. The most depressed people still have moments where they are feeling more or less depressed than the previous moment. They're not experiencing no human is experiencing the exact same level of anything every moment. People say, I'm always tired. Sure, but you're not the exact same level of tired. So there are variables that impact your experience of tiredness. And it is worthwhile to pay attention to those variables. Otherwise, a lot of what we're doing when we do that is saying to people, well, the world is exactly as it should be, and you're only experiencing any kind of discomfort because you are not constructed as you should be constructed. So you need to change so that you feel and think all the things that everybody else feels and thinks given the way the world is. But that's obviously ridiculous. So we take people, it's been 2 hours and I don't think anybody deliberately constructed this process this way. I think it's just everybody's doing their best to come up with their best ideas and move things forward. But the end result we have gotten to is we've taken the people who are anybody who's looking at the world the way that it is, society, culture, I mean, again, these are conceptual things, right? Anybody who's looking at things the way they are is like, I am unhappy about this. We are then saying, well, that's because you're wrong, not because anything should be different than it is. Just you should be different than you are. And obviously when I say it that way, everyone's gonna be like, oh, that's terrible. But if we phrase it differently, that it's in your control, and that if you want to feel differently and experience different things, all you have to do is learn to think and behave differently, or take different medication, or modify your diet, or whatever, but it's all in your control. That we really want to believe. Unfortunately, though, what's most comfortable to believe is a separate thing from what is most accurate. So this is a real sticky wicket here, where people have gotten a lot of relief from identifying in a particular way, not just by using that language, but the concepts and understandings they've attached to that language, right? Because I still can use that language even though I don't mean it in that way. Sounds like what you're talking about is similar to why I'm often uncomfortable with
Labeling things definitively.
Labeling things definitively. Yes, that is, again, these are constructs. A person's experience is real, and we create labels for everything, right? Fire is a label, it's a symbol.
I feel about my
represents
identity.
fire.
So like, if I choose this word, is it accurate?
Identity is one of those. Identity is labels. That doesn't mean that there's not a real experience or a real, like, actual thing that exists to which the label correlates. Presumably there is, otherwise there would be no point in coming up with a label that doesn't correlate to some actual thing. But being able to separate that, again, that's a cognitively oriented thing. People who are cognitively oriented in our culture is very much cognitively oriented and becoming more and more and more so by the day. In the same way that, like, the dominant eye, right? You need both of your eyes working in tandem to operate optimally, but you're going to default to one of those over the other. And so over time, one becomes the dominant, the predisposed without thinking about it, right? The mind, cognition, cognitive understanding, knowledge, etc., and the body includes the brain and the nervous system, the physical part of you that exists in physical reality, takes up space, is composed of matter. Those are like the two eyes that optimally they work in tandem, right? For the things to go as best as they can, you need both of those things working together in a particular kind of a way. And there's all kinds of times where you really only need one and not the other. And for various reasons over the course of our lives and what we're exposed to, and et cetera, we're going to end up with a predisposition to one of those being the dominant. And as we become people who are more and more cognitive dominant, this is the term I'm inventing right now. It's one of those terms that I feel like you could make a whole career off of, being like cognitive dominance or whatever. Anyway,
Another life.
we default to approaching things that way. You present me with a new problem and I think about it before I do something about it. Right? We all have times where we just do something without thinking. We all have times where we think something without doing, but the balance of those times is what we default to the most often in what context shifts. As we become more cognitively dominant, it really matters. We start to think that the labels and the symbols and the concepts and the abstract representation is the reality that dictates the rest of reality. That I feel the way I feel because I am an anxious person, not I can label myself as an anxious person because I feel this thing that is called anxiety, that I'm calling anxiety at this particular level.
Mm-hmm.
That you behave the way you behave because you are an introvert, rather than introvert is a label that we can apply to people who behave the way that you're behaving. The label comes second, and it is very useful to use those labels and then start to look at correlations and patterns and theorize about what things impact what things and what changes we could make in order. But that does not rely on treating the label as though it is the cause of the experience.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot be diagnosed as depressed unless you experience the diagnostic criteria of the major depressive disorder or whatever. You cannot be diagnosed as autistic unless you experience those diagnostic criteria. If you didn't experience those things, then we would not diagnose you as autistic. So it cannot be that the reason you're experiencing those things is because you're autistic. That's just the name we're calling it. The reason you're experiencing it, who knows? Impossible to know. And we can look at correlations, including biological ones. Again, I'm not saying that medical intervention, biological intervention isn't worthwhile. I take ADHD medication every day. I think it is very worthwhile. It's a very beneficial route to explore. But because we like to be able to understand things, we oversimplify and say, because medication is helpful, that means that this is only biological, rather than that just means that biology to some extent impacts these experiences, but it is not the only thing that impacts them. The more you rely on cognition, the more you oversimplify things. I know that sounds backwards. People tend to think like, oh, people who don't think, they just treat everything like it's simple. And it might be true that they act as though things are simple. But depth and breadth are kind of like, when you have finite resources, you can spend a majority of them on getting really deep, thorough knowledge or whatever skill in one area, or you can distribute them and have a wide breadth. Well, when we think as a way to navigate everything, even social interaction, everything, we're spreading that really broadly. So we're having a very simple and shallow conception of all of those things. And only when we like narrow in on a place where we go deep do we get nuance. So there's a joke that if you would ask an expert about any problem outside of their field, they're like, it is so simple, I don't understand why those idiots don't get it resolved. And then you ask them about any problem in their field, they're like, well, it's really complicated and we don't really know anything. Like, it is not simple. Anyway, that was the thing I was complaining about before, is that sometimes, and I'm not saying that it's intentional, this is survivorship bias, right? I'm most likely to hear about the ones that are very sensational, and people who aren't sensational, whether by design or by accident, I'm less likely to hear about. But yes, when these concepts spread like wildfire, I think it's helpful to like remind ourselves that it is likely untrue, the concept, the way it is being discussed. You know, like, because the truth of these things is so complicated and messy and boring that it doesn't spread very fast. So even if that's what the original message was, if it's spreading fast, it's a game of telephone and it got turned into some simple sensational idea that is definitely not accurate. Because, yeah, it just can't be. Narcissists, some people are narcissists and some people are not. That cannot be the case. That's not a real, like, narcissism is a concept, it is a construct. And if you look at the experts and what they talk about, they will say everyone is narcissistic. There's a spectrum of narcissism. And even if they think there's healthy and unhealthy narcissism, they'll say healthy is in this range and unhealthy are on these ends. But that's not the way that the messaging gets spread. And I do think that there is some responsibility on public intellectuals, people who deliberately go out of their way to put things out into the public for public consumption. There is responsibility on their part to consider how these things are going to be interpreted and to take responsibility when those things, even you can't figure out everything in advance, but when someone comes back to you and says, hey, this thing everybody's saying, that's BS or whatever, to be like, well, that's not really what I said, that's leaving out a lot of nuance, is a abdication of responsibility. To say, like, it's fine to be like, you are right, that is BS, and that's not what I was intending to convey. You know, there is nuance and whatever, but now that it's being brought to my attention that this is how it is being presented, it's important for me to acknowledge and help spread the message that that conceptualization of it is wrong. It is nonsense, even if that means I am going against my own career as a public intellectual to say, like, hey, what everybody's been so excited about my work, that's not real. Whatever, this doesn't matter. The old man yells at cloud stuff.
I spaced out too because I was reading a comment.
Tells me that I spend very little time. Yeah, I recognize that labels can be valuable to help us relate to each other, but creating a permanent label can cement it in place and often oversimplify. No perfect maps and all that. It helps me that I spend very little time on social media, and when I'm on Instagram, it's to watch cat videos and help and hear people get very excited about birds or their D&D characters. I usually hear about new things through podcasts. Yeah, and a lot of this is just the nature of like scale, right? Like a message that is conveyed to 1,000 people has to be worded in some way that is accessible to 1,000 different people. So it cannot be very specific. It has to be somewhat general. And podcasts only have X amount of time, and they're trying to balance, as all things are, how much of your attention we're asking for and earning versus how much of that attention we're using. And yeah, it's just the reality is it's not even possible, and definitely wouldn't be desirable for every person to understand everything in depth and nuance and detail, but that it is on each of us who does understand something in more depth and nuance and detail, that when we hear or interact with some simplified version that is simplified in a problematic way, you know, it's not about being pedantic, like, actually, it's a lot more complicated than that. It's if the simplification is causing some issue for somebody, then I think it's on us to be able to say, like, oh, I hear what you're saying, I totally get it, and let me help you give you some more context.
I'm sorry, that emoji is so funny. The guy pointing at the clouds.
Okay, clouds for the emoji. Yeah, I like that. That's kind of like that, I forget, there's a term for that, but having to think in reverse, you know, like do the second step first. Anyway, we should wrap up. It's been 2 hours and 15 minutes. It's good to be with you all. Thank you, Bast Insider and Stephen and Mimi the Evie for participating in chat. We will be back same time next week. Thank you all.